Okay, apologies for that. So let's just get back into it. Um, Discord and OBS have a bad habit of changing your default audio settings. Anyways, so I've been trying to get back into reading physical media a bit more, trying to read books and stuff like that, like physical ones instead of audiobooks. So I was at the library the other day and they had a copy of How States Think, which I think is the newest John Mearsheimer book. And I was reading through it and he was talking about how rational decisions are made and credible versus non-credible policies and theories and stuff like that. And this is something I've been noticing. And I think during the Biden administration, you had people on both the dissident right, and I'll use the term dissident left in this particular situation, who were kind of in an uneasy alliance between in their mutual opposition to, I guess, what you could call the global American empire, neoliberalism, Biden, and stuff like that. So it wasn't so much that they agreed with each other on ideology, but it was kind of an alliance of convenience. And I don't have an example off the top of my head, but you had a lot of cases where like people were on like the dissident right or dissident left, and they would go on each other's shows and they would like pretend that everybody was on the same page and stuff like that. I'm sure people know what I'm referring to. And I found, as immediately as soon as Trump got elected, there was a massive kind of break in that. I had noticed this going a while back, that people oppose the global American empire for different reasons. And I think it broadly falls into two camps. There's like the right or centrist camp who tended to be anti. Once again, I'm just going to use the term global American empire or anti neoliberalism for one of two reasons. Either for pragmatic reasons, in the fact that they felt that, like Mearsheimer, a unipolar moment is not sustainable, it's not natural, it's not how the world is generally functions, and it doesn't really function in that way. I'm sorry if I'm not really explaining that very well. And it can't last, and that America cannot have the resources to maintain a global empire as the sole superpower. Just that that's not possible. Eventually, it's going to collapse, and the effort of trying to maintain this, of backing all these people around the world, of fighting like in Ukraine and China and the Middle East and stuff like that, will eventually bankrupt America. It's not in America's rational self-interest. So I think you have those type of people. Mersheimer, I think, is actually, he's either apolitical or I think he's probably a liberal or a centrist or something. The only thing on domestic politics I know of is he supported Bernie Sanders on the grounds that wealth inequality was destabilizing America. So, but the point is that it's from a unemotional, rational look at it. It's saying that America can't afford to maintain this empire. It's not the natural state of affairs. It's causing all kinds of issues and instability in the international system. And water needs to find its level. We need to kind of go back to something more like, if not the 20th century, the 19th century or something like that, where there's a number of different powers and we have kind of multipolarity. So the other side of this, the other part of, I guess you could say, that kind of side of the equation, is people who, on the dissident right, tend to agree with that. Mearsheimer has said he is a liberal, but I assume he means liberal in the classical sense. Yeah, I would also say his objection to like utopian projects is kind of classically liberal, that kind of thing. He wrote like a whole book though about how the, and I have it, I just haven't read it yet, about how um, the global liberal project is a disaster and was a mistake. But you have the other group of people on the right who didn't like the global American empire because it was promoting things that they didn't agree with, that it was forcing gay marriage, abortion, open borders on a lot of other countries, that it was undermining Europe, it was undermining Japan, that a lot of traditional societies or more conservative societies were having their governments overthrown in color revolutions, that the US was funding opposition media, that they were actively trying to subvert these societies, and that was the reason they disliked it. So, on one level, they disliked it because, once again, it was taking a lot of resources, and it didn't seem like it was really worth it, and America wasn't getting anything out of it. But they also disliked it because it was, for lack of a better term, gay. They just thought it was spreading really bad values around the world, and I think that's the one side. It's either it comes out of pragmatism, nationalism, or conservative values. Now, in this case, I'm calling the dissident left the people who disagree with neoliberalism, at least in America. They're the people who didn't support. So I think, okay, so let me just take a step back. So I think during Occupy Wall Street, what wound up happening is the last remnant of what you, I guess, call the populist left or the old left or whatever, the leftists as they existed during the 2000s and 90s disappeared, and they did a 180 on a lot of issues. Stuff, because I remember back in university before the financial crisis, well, for a year or two before it, the left was pro like economic nationalism. They were very anti neoliberalism. They were pro like redistribution of wealth. They were very anti corporate. Anti vax movement I found used to be a left wing position, and they used to be anti Israel, and just a lot of stuff like that. And I feel like the people who maintain that, I'm just going to call the dissident left. So people who are against neoliberalism, people who are against corporations, people like that, I think are unwelcome largely in the modern left. Also, like left wing Eurosceptics, I would put in this category, who are against it because it's like a capitalist project or something like that. And I think anyone on the left who still cares about economics. So, like, I would say in America, if you're on the left and you're pro tariffs, or you're anti corporation, or you're skeptical of big pharma, or insurance companies, or banks, or anything like that, you are not in line with, I think, the mainstream positions of the Democratic Party and left wing media. And I think that's fairly true throughout the United States and Europe. So you can agree or disagree with that. I hope I at least provided a definition or explained what my thinking was. So, that those people were RFK. Yeah, maybe it's less defined, but you get what I mean. Like the dissident left, the non-mainstream left, the alternative left. And that includes all kinds of different people. That includes the old left. That includes Maoists. That includes left libertarians and stuff like that. So they hated the global American empire for very different reasons than the right wing people did, or the right or centrist or pragmatists or realists or whatever you want to call them. And I noticed this throughout the entirety of the Ukraine conflict, is you had people who were against intervening in Ukraine because they sympathized with Russia, because they viewed Russia as a more conservative society, or just that they, for pragmatic reasons, like they said, okay, well, the natural spheres of influence are natural. Russia's a great power. Ukraine's clearly in its sphere of influence. We have to respect that, or there's no direct benefit of America to get involved in this. Like, America's not getting anything out of it, so why are they even bothering? And I think that is so you have that. The more dissident left people, I think, didn't like it because they viewed America as a white country, a white Christian country that was engaged in neocolonialism. And you will hear this from time to time. This is the BRIC states. As you go through it, they will say, "Oh, well, America's a white supremacist state. It's trying to impose Christian European values on the world. Neoliberalism is governed by like white people in Europe," and they're very much against the American empire, not for kind of a pragmatic reason or for a like they disagree with its values fundamentally. If they disagree with its values, it's because its values aren't like far left enough. They aren't woke enough, or whatever you want to put it. In fact, I think they see like wokeness as being a like subversion of, I don't know, left wing ideology or something like that. But a big divide I find in case of this is there are people who are sympathetic to Russia but not sympathetic to China. And I think that's a big divide because there are a lot of people in MAGA who are sympathetic to Russia and want relations with Russia, who don't want the same deal with China. And they are still on, like, another key issue is Venezuela. The people on kind of the right and center side don't like Venezuela. They think it's a third world hellhole, whereas the people on the dissident right view it as this great country that all of its problems stem from the fact that there's blockades and other kind of other restrictions on it. So they don't really have an issue with like it's kind of confusing because, and I saw this particularly with Brian Berletic, who I think is the kind of the poster child of this, wherein it was really hard because he's very left wing, but he's also pro Russia. So it leads to this bizarre scenario where they're trying to like say, oh, Russia's diversity, Russia's like supportive of all our policies, wherein Russia like has laws against gay propaganda, and a lot of just kind of socially conservative laws. Russia isn't like the Christian utopia people think it is, but it's a lot more conservative on a lot of these issues than the US and most Western countries are. So it's like you have to defend that, or like in the case of Thailand, he had to defend like the conservative Thai monarchy, and you can tell like he probably doesn't agree with them ideologically, but because they're the non-white backside, they feel obligated to defend them, and it leads to really weird scenarios. So I think you're starting to see this divide. So the people who are kind of on the right and center side are largely happy with what Trump's doing in terms of foreign policy because they view it as kind of a return to rationality, a return to normal, an abandonment of this hegemonic, messianic vision of America spreading liberalism and democracy throughout the world, and going back to kind of being a normal state with normal state interests. Whereas the other side doesn't like this because they don't want a world of great powers with spheres of influence. They have more utopian ideas about countries being, I don't know, completely sovereign or a global government running things. They don't like the idea of great powers. They might support it temporarily, but they would prefer, for instance, if the UN just functioned as a global parliament and their decisions were legally binding, or just that there was no spheres of influence and individual countries could just basically do what they want and stuff like that. Ultimately, though, I think it comes from a hatred of basically European civilization, and in that I'm including America, like the various countries. Another issue, and I saw this the other day, is the idea. Um, I'm Thai. I think the reason we go with brick now is for hundreds of years we're under the influence of China. Yeah, like China has. People pretend that China is like this isolationist country. China has flooded a lot of Southeast Asia with Chinese immigrants who have formed an elite caste in a lot of these societies. I think that's true in Thailand. You can correct me, Shin Inaho, if I'm wrong. I know in Malaysia that's the case, the Philippines, Indonesia, and they kind of are wielding disproportionate political power in order to align these states with China and to kind of undermine the local population. I think that's happened in Nepal recently. But anyways, so and they're largely the people on the left are largely okay with that because China is not a white country. So that's how I kind of view it. To be honest, where I know those immigrants came a long time ago. It's gotten, I think it's gotten particularly bad in Malaysia recently, but we're getting off topic. We're getting off topic. So, yeah, that's kind of how I see the divide. Now, another one I'm seeing is the whole um, Monroe Doctrine. So, I find a lot of the MAGA people or the pro-Trump people tend to think the Monroe Doctrine is largely true, that the Western Hemisphere and the Americas are within the American sphere of influence, and they have a certain inherent guardianship or paternal rule over them, responsibility over them. And that is, MAGA likes that, but the kind of the more third worldist people hate that because once again it's white people governing over indigenous people in like countries like they like countries like Bolivia or Venezuela or stuff like that. So I think those are, I don't know, people. What do you think? Am I stretching too much here? Between the various groups and what's going on. Like a lot of the MAGA people are uh, going over are were like supporting annexation of Greenland or Canada because they view that as within their sphere of influence. That they are small countries, relatively speaking. So okay, Servius, how am I stretching? You're welcome to explain. So I think that's kind of the way that they think, and you should stop listening to manga. I I don't understand. Like people say this, I don't get how me trying to explain what somebody else thinks is me agreeing with them. Um, I don't necessarily agree with everything they're saying. I'm just saying that is, I think, one of the sides that's emerging in kind of the more recent political, international politics perspective. So I think the only, so the left, at least like the neoliberal left, was kind of weird because they sort of believed in global government, but not exactly. You had like the rules based international order, which basically meant all the countries um, had to be accept social liberalism and globalism and open borders and all that kind of stuff. And there's kind of this weird, and I noticed this back in university when I was studying some of this stuff. The UN is a very strange institution from an ideological standpoint because theoretically, um, the like neoliberals should like the UN because it's kind of a global government, but it's not one they can control in the same way as like the World Economic Forum or the Bilderberg Group or something like that. So it winds up being this like weird case where a lot of neutral or like nationalist countries will like the UN despite it being the closest thing to a global government. It's really weird. The UN, I find, is one of the more incoherent parts of looking at international affairs. Um, with regards to, I wasn't saying that. So the Monroe Doctrine isn't necessarily enforced, but it is an ideological position within America. It was particularly prevalent during the Cold War, and there is a desire among, I think, a lot of the right in America to say, okay, we should abandon like Ukraine and some of our like ops we're running in the Caucasus or Southeast Asia or something, and we need to reestablish control over the Americas as our natural sphere of influence. I think it is what I'm trying to say. It's in practice, it's obviously not always the case, but I think that has been an ideological current um, for that time. Uh, so, like Russia has the concept of Eurasianism. That doesn't mean all the ex-Soviet Union countries are necessarily under the control of Russia, but there are a lot of people in Russia who feel that they should be, like that Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan should be within the um, sphere of influence. Let's see here. But yeah, the UN is a weird institution because they more kind of side with the third world, but I find sometimes kind of the more right leaning people, if the UN does something they agree with, they'll side with it. I am kind of ambivalent about the UN, to be honest. So what else is there? So I don't know. I think those are kind of that's where the ideological split is, and I can tell like a lot of people are really angry about what's Trump's doing, who were anti-Biden, and view him as like being neo-imperialist and he's a return to 19th century colonialism or whatever it is. Versus the people who are okay with that and are willing to just kind of accept the world as it is, which is more kind of the realist conception wherein states are the primary actors, and then the structure of the international system, power relations, balance of power, and all that kind of military force is kind of determines where the way the world is. Yes, there's ideology. Yes, there's beliefs. Yes, there's the specifics of individual countries, but ultimately, it's about great power politics. Yeah, the UN has all kind. Yeah, but it's weird because the UN is hated, or at least it was hated by the neocons, and neoliberals seem to not like the UN really. Although it kind of goes along. Once again, I just find it a strange case that I've never really been able to make much out of. Uh, I personally don't think there's anything wrong with the UN as a concept. I just don't think it should pretend to be a global government. I think it's a good place for diplomacy and for countries to express their position on things and stuff like that. But I don't really think I don't know. There's some international treaties I like. I think the Test Ban Treaty's good. I think the Geneva Convention's good. Some of the other stuff that international treaties are good, but I don't know. The idea that it's a global government and it's not, it has any kind of independent influence beyond what states give it is wrong. So then that brings us to A lot of so part of the idea is that it's immoral for countries to not be fully independent. That is, it is immoral for Russia and Guatemala to not have the same degree of autonomy in international affairs and to not be free from the influence of other countries to the same degree. The idea is all countries should have a basic equality among themselves, and there just shouldn't be spheres of influence. One should be completely independent from another. I just don't think it works that way. I think spheres of influences are natural, and some countries are just not strong. A lot of countries are just not strong enough to be their own masters. And if they don't have the protection of a bigger state, someone else might gobble them up or might invade them. And having big countries uh, be protectors of them helps to keep the international system stable uh, and to prevent too many like borders changing and stuff like that. I don't know. Once again, people are free to agree or disagree with me on that. It's a hotly debated topic as to whether spheres of influence are a good thing or a bad thing. I just think it's natural. Um, and I think it's better to just kind of try to deal with it. Arjun is an imperialist. I don't know, like, what do you want me to say? Um, I've never been a third worldist. I even did a video a while back. I'm not a third worldist. I just want the insanity to stop. Uh, so, I don't know. That doesn't mean you have to directly control the countries, but there is kind of an understanding that they are under the protection of a particular country, and there's certain obligations that go both ways between the two of them. But once again, you see that in a lot of the MAGA people is they're like, we don't mind there being like the Monroe Doctrine or even something like NATO. It just can't serve like global homo. Is basically is basically what a lot of them are feeling, and they don't really mind having influence or things like that. So I don't know. I think that's the divide. I'm seeing that forming. Was it going to be significant outside of internet circles? Probably not, but I just find it interesting. Shouldn't we not? We just not take over other people's countries because that causes more problems. That's not how a sphere of influence works. A sphere of influence doesn't mean that you invade every country, make them puppet states and stuff like that. It means that there is a certain um, client patron relationship between them, in which the patron state will vote with the client. No, the yeah, the client state will vote with the patron in international affairs and give them preferential treatment and trade deals and stuff like that. And there will be an implicit offer of protection from the larger state to prevent another external threat going after them. And I think that's just kind of natural. Um, Inevitably, the cultural power of larger countries and the economic power will lead to an asymmetry of force. So, yeah. Um, Part of the issue, and this is where we get into the whole prisoner dilemma. Um, the whole prisoner dilemma is there's an idea that if you don't do something, somebody else will. If you don't make a country your client, if you don't grab certain resources, somebody else will, and that might change the fundamental balance of power. Something I do find interesting is at the moment we have three great powers in the world. America, Russia, and China, and their spheres of influence in a lot of ways resemble the ones of 1980. Well, no, in a little bit they resemble 1984, which I think is interesting. Let's see here. I think another thing where you can kind of tell a divide is there are people who don't really like the global American empire, but have different opinions on Korea, the Korean and Vietnam War. Because I think you can be anti-communist without being a neoconservative. I don't think the two things are necessarily the same thing. Were the dissident right and dissident left united on a front prior to this split besides disdain for our greatest ally? Um, they opposed American influence in a lot of other countries and American interference, but like I said, for fundamentally different reasons. One, because they didn't like the particular ideology they was spreading and they didn't like the burdens of empire. And the other, because they viewed America as a white imperialist country. So, um, I think there was kind of that, but it was always very sketchy. And I felt whenever you had meetings between the different groups of people, they would just deliberately avoid talking about like social issues or things like that. Like there are a lot of people who still believe in the greatness of European civilization and Christianity, but didn't support the American empire because of the principles it was spreading. There's also people who can believe in the greatness of Europe and Christianity and think that the colonial era was a mistake, either because it was immoral or just because it was a massive waste of time and resources trying to develop parts of the world and hold on to them that don't that weren't really worth it. I think that's more than anything else the reason why the colonial empires kind of fell apart is they were just not profitable. They were a huge drain on resources. I think de Gaulle said that was his reason for decolonization more than anything else, was just that it placed a massive financial burden on the French people and they didn't really get much out of it. So, yeah, I think that's definitely part of it, why it kind of fell apart. Uh, a lot of the territories the British held were just, it was just a massive pain to deal with. Theoretically, taking over Canada would be easy. Just look at what the U.S. did with Texas. Um, the U.S. would tariff Canadian goods or provinces that the U.S. doesn't have influence in free trade others. Well, you don't necessarily have to annex a country to have some degree of control over it. Like as a Canadian, I understand that Canada is not a big enough country. I get that we're huge, but you get what I mean in terms of population, economic power, and military power to be um, to be kind of its own master and to not be part of a bigger alliance. So, yeah. It's like being anti-fat. Yeah, like fascism doesn't exist anymore. Um, People keep it's like the whole anti-Nazi thing and comparing everything to Hitler. Um, that's not really the case. So, like, aside from a couple larpers on the internet, it doesn't really exist. Um, so yeah, let's see here. Is there any comments? I still don't really get why the U.S. would even want to take over Canada. All it would do is just add 10 more. It would either add a new California because Canada is roughly the size of California in terms of its population, or it would create 10 blue states. I don't really get why that is desirable to the American right. Um, if Canada was integrated, basically the Democrats would win every election and the Democratic Party would move to the left. It is basically what would happen. I think it's much better to, I don't know, influence or something like that. Canada has too much value and too little power to keep it without being in a great power sphere. Yeah, and once again, like being in a great power sphere isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like in a lot of cases, having America as your sugar daddy um, during the Cold War wasn't bad. Like it wasn't a bad to have if you were Japan or South Korea to have America as your sugar daddy. They basically just gave you money and weapons and protected you, and you had to say communism sucked and trade with them, and it worked out pretty well. It's like I don't really entirely get the people who are really in Korea and Japan who are like really anti-American, because I feel like the relationship has really benefited them by and large. Uh, Another an interesting example of this is some countries I think benefit a lot from being a middleman. That is, they're in two great power spheres of influence, and both countries are okay with them being kind of a buffer state or a neutral state. Obviously, Mongolia is a good example of this. Someone jokingly said that Mongolia has an infinite money glitch because it's bordered by two great powers, which I think is pretty funny. Another example was Finland. Finland was neutral during the Cold War, but was kind of within the USSR's sphere of influence, and they kind of had the benefit then of being able to trade with both sides. Uh, Yugoslavia, I think, also had a decent deal during the Cold War. It was a neutral socialist country, so they would do business with the West, they would do business with the East, and they could kind of act as a mediator between the two of them and trade. And I think that was the scenario that if Ukraine had been a bit smarter, they could have adopted. They could have been well. I mean, they were making a lot of money as a transit hub between Russia and Europe through all the gas deals and stuff like that. It's there's nothing wrong with being kind of a middleman. You just have to figure out what your niche is and try to exploit it. Um, so I think that is an aspect of it. So what else are we? What's interesting to me is we have a couple middle powers rising. None of them, I think, will ever be great powers, but they're trying to develop their own mini spheres of influence. So, like Iran and Turkey, I would say, are middle powers at this point in time. And they're both trying to develop their own spheres of influence, but I don't think they'll ever be able to challenge the great powers. The problem with flirting with two great powers is if you happen to get too close to one. I think Canada might have touched the bottom line for America with China, or so I hear. Yes, but I don't see Canada. Canada's not a buffer state. There's not an interest of both groups of keeping Canada neutral. Um, Whereas the Chinese and Russians both have an interest in Mongolia being neutral and independent because it dramatically limits the amount of border they have to defend. Um, so Switzerland, for instance, is useful for all the parties involved because it makes it harder for them to go to war with each other. None of the powers have to defend that border. Let's see here. Ukraine's, yeah, I know that is Ukraine's niche, but I'm saying that was, I think, another option that was available to them is to be like that. Is an Islamic great power possible? Possibly if the Saudis get overthrown. I don't see another great power emerging at any point in the near future. People can debate with me on that. I feel like you have America, Russia, China, and then it goes way down after that, and no one else is really vaguely close. I get that there's very economically powerful countries like Japan, but I just don't see like between its demographic issues, and I get that the other countries have demographic issues. Its lack of a military and other things, I just don't see it, or having the ideology to kind of spread influence. I just think India is a dumpster fire. Um, I don't know. I just can't see it forming its own uh, sphere of influence and managing to get beyond its borders too much. Turkey, I don't think will ever be a great power. I just don't think it has the population and power projection necessary to be a great power anymore, or will. But it's definitely one of the stronger middle powers. And I think Erdogan's done a good job of uh, kind of realizing his position that Turkey is too big and too important and too powerful that neither Russia nor the Western Bloc can afford to alienate them. So Turkey just plays both sides. Turkey will play Russia, Turkey will play China, Turkey will play America, and they'll get a deal from one and then go to the other people and ask them if they're going to beat that deal. Is kind of where Turkey is. I don't know. I just don't see like any of these countries becoming like reaching great power status in the foreseeable future. Um, they might become middle powers, but I think on a global scale, the European countries I think have long since lost that status. I think that the Ukraine war has really like confirmed how weak France and Britain have gotten. The fact that they only have a couple of like they have like I think the UK has like 20 tanks left that are operational. It's some ridiculous number. They have more admirals than ships. I mean, Israel isn't a great power. Israel's barely even a middle power anymore. The whole like last 2 years has just been a mess. Like they couldn't beat Hamas, they couldn't beat Hezbollah. I don't know what they were doing in Syria, but that happened. I mean, did they achieve any of their objectives? I don't really think that they did. I guess they killed a couple of leaders and they leveled the Gaza Strip. Maybe I don't know if they're still keeping the territory they occupied in Syria or not, but I don't really get what they ultimately accomplished. Um, it was just kind of a shit show. Uh, they killed a lot of people and they made a lot of people angry, but now with regards to an Islamic superpower, I mean the closest we'll probably either get would be um, Iran or great power Iran or Turkey. Um, Indonesia, I think, is too divided, and I don't think it's particularly interested in expansionism. So I don't know if it's really viable to go there. I just feel like they don't necessarily. I don't know a ton about Indonesia, but even then, I just don't think Iran and Turkey will peak nearly as high as the other people are. So, as for an Islamic superpower, other than that, I mean, I think Pan Arabism is basically dead at this point in time. I don't really, especially with Assad like being overthrown. That was like the last pseudo Pan Arabist leader. Um, I don't see any real impetus to unify all the countries together. There's so many different interests. There's different governmental systems. Some are socialist. A lot of them have severe internal issues. Egypt does, Libya does, Iraq does, Jordan does. Not sure what Saudi Arabia is like at the moment. I think it's stabilized a bit under MBS. Yemen is a shit show. A lot of the Arab countries are like in complete disarray. Um, so, I mean, Rwanda punches really high above its weight, but it's just its population. I just don't think is high enough to really do much with it. But I don't know. So I hope people. I didn't have a ton else to say, but yeah, I just wanted to kind of go through that, and that's just a trend that I've been noticing. And sometimes with some of these things, it's not about something specific. It's about taking a look at how the situation is on the whole, and so you have that lens to maybe look things through. So the next time you see one of these debates or stuff like that, you're able to go through it. One ANC politician in South Africa said, why do we need farmers? We just get our food from the grocery store. Like, the Servius, what is it that you want me to say? Like, you want me to go through what good would going through every single coup and civil war that happened in Latin America? Like, why, I don't understand the relevance of it. Okay, so this actually happened. Oh, did it? Okay, I guess it's 1 second.
Widest level is what, 12
Sorry if the audio
miles? Shit. This is a island that at its widest level is what, 12 miles from shore to shore, and at its smallest level or smallest location, it's 7 miles between one shore and the other. Is that correct?
I don't have the exact dimensions, but to your point, sir, I think Guam is a small island.
Very small island, and about 24 miles, if I recall, long. So 24 miles long, about 7 miles wide at the least widest place on the island, and about 12 miles wide.
You'll get to the good part in a second.
On the widest part of the island. And I don't know how many square miles that is. Do you happen to know?
I don't have that figure with me, sir. I can certainly supply it to you if you'd like.
Yeah, my fear is that the whole island will become so overly populated that it will tip over and capsize.
We don't anticipate that. The Guam population, I think, currently about 175,000, and again, with 8,000 Marines and their families.
It's the island's just gonna tip over. Let's listen to that again.
And capsize. The island will become so overly populated that it will tip over and capsize.
We don't anticipate that. The Guam.
As somebody put it, that's just how he talks. As somebody put it, that's like the best example of military discipline I've ever seen. Is that the general's like, we don't anticipate that, sir. Like, he just was able to just be like, play it straight. So, is that an allegory? No, I don't think so. I think he actually thinks that islands float is probably what he's imagining. And for our moment of Zen, we will take a look at Al Sharpton, Resist We Much.
Tonight is the measure of whether the country begins in the state of Wisconsin a national drive to push back, or whether we have more to go to build a movement of resistance. But resist we much. We must and we will much about that be committed.
God bless, Al. I 100% agree with you. I don't know what you just said, but it sounded pretty cool to me. Anyways, God bless everybody. Have a good weekend. We'll talk to you.